That leads us to this first point that you can write down it's like learning 911. It's this first part is that all of this stuff, all of this suffering is part of God's will. We know that no matter what it is, it lines up with the sovereign will of God. Now, if you're like me and you hear that and say, well, look, I know it's part of God's sovereign will, but you mean to tell me that it is God's will that this awful, awful thing is happening to me, that these struggles that I'm facing, this is part of God's plan for me, is all of this evil to walk into my life, and now I'm struggling with that. That's God's will. He wants that for me. What do I do with that? Well, let's go back up to verse 12. This is why I say this passage right before us gives us a little more flavor. He begins by saying this: if we know in verse 19 that whatever the suffering is part of God's will, his sovereign plan, look with me in verse 12. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you as though something strange were happening. He begins this entire passage by saying, beloved. Before we begin in the pain and suffering and anxiety and all of this, he speaks this word beloved. He's saying God loves you. Matter of fact, he loves you more than his own life. He's the one who walked all the way to the cross. He was beaten and spit on and humiliated and nailed on this cross to hang there for hours. He loves you, and he is willing to go to whatever length to deliver and redeem. We sometimes fail to recognize in the midst of this will of God that he loves us so dearly that he will move heaven and earth to impact our life. We are beloved, and he says, do not be surprised when these trials come. If you are alive, you breathe and you have a heartbeat, it is only a matter of time before problems show up in your life. I don't know how long you have to live, maybe an hour before some of the first problems begin to set in. But the longer you live, the more trials and tribulations you walk through. It's a matter of time. And he says, don't be surprised. But many of us are shocked when this happens. And it may be true that you had no idea that it was on its way. But the reality is God knew it was coming. He already knew. It's part of his plan and his purpose, his will. It does not show up in your life without his consent. There is nothing that happens to you that is outside of what God already knows is coming. He says, don't be surprised at the fiery trial.